In France, though nothing so deliberately tedious as Robert Elsmere had been produced, things are not much better. M. Guy de Maupassant, with his keen mordant irony and his hard vivid style, strips life of the few poor rags that still cover her, and shows us foul sore and festering wound. He writes lurid little tragedies in which everybody is ridiculous, bitter comedies at which one cannot laugh for very tears. M. Zola, true to the lofty principle that he lays down in one of his pronunciamientos on literature, L'homme de génie n'a jamais d'esprit, is determined to show that if he has not got genius he can at least be dull, and how well he succeeds! He is not without power. Indeed, at times, as in Germinal, there is something almost epic in his work. But his work is entirely wrong from beginning to end, and wrong not on the ground of morals, but on the ground of art. From any ethical standpoint, it is just what it should be. The author is perfectly truthful and describes things exactly as they happen. What more can any moralist desire? We have no sympathy at all with the moral indignation of our time against M. Zola. It is simply the indignation of Tartuffe on being exposed. But from the standpoint of art, what can be said in favor of the author of L'Assommoir, Nana, and Pobui? Nothing. Mr. Ruskin once described the characters in George Eliot's novels as being like the sweepings of a Pentonville omnibus, but Mem Zola's characters are much worse. They have their dreary vices and their drearier virtues. The record of their lives is absolutely without interest. Who cares what happens to them? In literature, we require distinction, charm, beauty, and imaginative power. We don't want to be harrowed and disgusted with an account of the doings of the lower orders. M. Daudet is better. He has wit, a light touch, and an amusing style, but he has lately committed literary suicide. Nobody can possibly care for Delobel with his Il faut lutter pour l'art, or for Valmachor with his eternal refrain about the nightingale, or for the poet in Jack with his mot cruel, now that we have learned from 20 ans de ma vie littéraire that these characters were taken directly from life. To us they seem to have suddenly lost all their vitality, all the few qualities they ever possessed. The only real people are the people who never existed, and if a novelist is base enough to go to life for his personages, he should at least pretend that they are creations, and not boast of them as copies. The justification of a character in a novel is not that other persons are what they are, but that the author is what he is. Otherwise, the novel is not a work of art. As for M. Paul Bourget, the master of the roman psychologique, he commits the error of imagining that the men and women of modern life are capable of being infinitely analyzed for an innumerable series of chapters. In point of fact, what is interesting about people in good society, and M. Bourget rarely moves out of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, except to come to London, is the mask that each one of them wears, not the reality that lies behind the mask. It is a humiliating confession, but we are all of us made out of the same stuff. In Falstaff there is something of Hamlet, in Hamlet there is not a little of Falstaff. The fat knight has his moods of melancholy, and the young prince his moments of coarse humor. Where we differ from each other is purely in accidentals. In dress, manner, tone of voice, religious opinions, personal appearance, tricks of habits, and the like. The more one analyzes people, the more all reasons for analysis disappear. Sooner or later, one comes to that dreadful universal thing called human nature. Indeed, as anyone who has ever worked among the poor knows only too well, the brotherhood of man is no mere poet's dream. It is a most depressing and humiliating reality. And if a writer insists upon analyzing the upper classes, He might just as well write of match girls and costermongers at once. However, my dear Cyril, I will not detain you any further here. I quite admit that modern novels have many good points. All I insist on is that as a class they are quite unreadable.
That is certainly a very grave qualification, but I must say that I think you are rather unfair in some of your strictures. I like the Deemster and the Daughter of Heth, and Le Disciple, and Mr. Isaacs, and as for Robert Elsmere, I am quite devoted to it. Not that I can look upon it as a serious work. As a statement of the problems that confront the earnest Christian, it is ridiculous and antiquated. It is simply honors literature and dogma, with the literature left out. It is as much behind as the age of Paley's evidences, or Colenso's method of biblical exegesis. Nor could anything be less impressive than the unfortunate hero gravely heralding a dawn that rose long ago, and so completely missing its true significance that he proposes to carry on the business of the old firm under the new name. On the other hand, it contains several clever caricatures and a heap of delightful quotations, and Green's philosophy very pleasantly sugars the somewhat bitter pill of the author's fiction. I also cannot help expressing my surprise that you have said nothing about the two novelists whom you are always reading, Balzac and George Meredith. Surely they are realists, both of them.
Ah, Meredith, who can define him? His style is chaos illumined by flashes of lightning. As a writer, he has mastered everything except language. As a novelist, he can do everything but tell a story. As an artist, he is everything except articulate. Somebody in Shakespeare, Touchstone I think, talks about a man who is always breaking his shins over his own wit. And it seems to me that this might serve as the basis for a criticism of Meredith's method. But whatever he is not a realist. Or rather, I would say that he is a child of realism, who is not on speaking terms with his father. By deliberate choice, he has made himself a romanticist. He has refused to bow the knee to Baal, and after all, even if the man's fine spirit did not revolt against the noisy assertions of realism, his style would be quite sufficient of itself to keep life at a respectful distance. By its means he has planted round his garden a hedge full of thorns, and red with wonderful roses. As for Balzac, he was a most remarkable combination of the artistic temperament with the scientific spirit. The latter he bequeathed to his disciples. The former was entirely his own. The difference between such a book as Zola's L'Assommoir and Balzac's Illusion perdue is the difference between unimaginative realism and imaginative reality. All Balzac's characters and Baudelaire are gifted with the same ardor of life that animated himself. All his fictions are as deeply colored as dreams. Each mind is a weapon loaded to the muzzle with will. The very scullions have genius. A steady course of Balzac reduces our living friends to shadows, and our acquaintances to the shadows of shades. His characters have a kind of fervent, fiery-colored existence. They dominate us and defy skepticism. One of the greatest tragedies of my life is the death of Lucien de Rubempré. It is a grief from which I have never been able to completely rid myself. It haunts me in my moments of pleasure. I remember it when I laugh. But Balzac is no more a realist than Holbein was. He created life, he did not copy it. I admit, however, that he set far too high a value on modernity of form, and that, consequently, there is no book of his that as an artistic masterpiece can rank with Salammbô or Esmond, or The Cloister and the Hearth, or the Vicomte de Bragelonne.
Do you object to modernity of form, then?
Yes, it is a huge price to pay for a very poor result. Pure modernity of form is always somewhat vulgarizing. It cannot help being so. The public imagine that because they are interested in their immediate surroundings, art should be interested in them also, and should take them as her subject matter. But the mere fact that they are interested in these things makes them unsuitable subjects for art. The only beautiful things, as somebody once said, are the things that do not concern us. As long as a thing is useful or necessary to us or affects us in any way, either for pain or for pleasure, or appeals strongly to our sympathies or is a vital part of the environment in which we live, it is outside the proper sphere of art. To art's subject matter, we should be more or less indifferent. We should at any rate have no preferences, no prejudices, no partisan feelings of any kind. It is exactly because Hecuba is nothing to us that her sorrows are such an admirable motive for a tragedy. I do not know anything in the whole motive for a tragedy. I do not know anything in the whole history of literature sadder than the artistic career of Charles Reade. He wrote one beautiful book, The Cloister and the Hearth, a book as much above Romola is above Daniel Deronda, and wasted the rest of his life in a foolish attempt to be modern, to draw public attention to the state of our convict prisons and the management of our private lunatic asylums. Charles Dickens was depressing enough in all conscience when he tried to arouse our sympathy for the victims of the Poor Law Administration. Charles Reade, an artist, scholar, a man with a true sense of beauty, raging and roaring over the abuses of contemporary life like a common pamphleteer or a sensational journalist, is really a sight for the angels to weep over. Believe me, my dear Cyril, modernity of form and modernity of subject matter are entirely and absolutely wrong. We have mistaken the common livery of the age for the vesture of the vesture of the muses, and spend our days in the sordid streets and hideous suburbs of our vile cities, when we should be out on the hillside with Apollo. Certainly, we are a degraded race, and have sold our birthright for a mess of facts.
There is something in what you say, and there is no doubt that whatever amusement we may find in reading a purely modern novel, we have rarely an artistic pleasure in rereading it, and this is perhaps the best rough test of what is literature and what is not. If one cannot enjoy reading a book over and over again, there is no use in reading it at all. But what do you say about the return to life and nature? This is the panacea that is always being recommended to us.
I will read you what I say on the subject. The passage comes later on in the article, but I may as well give it to you now. The popular cry of our time is, "Let us return to life and nature. They will recreate art for us, and send the red blood coursing through her veins. They will shoe her feet with swiftness, and make her hands strong." But alas, we are mistaken in our amiable and well-meaning efforts. Nature is always behind the age, and as for life, she is the solvent that breaks up art, the enemy that lays waste her house.
What do you mean by saying that nature is always behind the age?
Well, perhaps that is rather cryptic. What I mean is this. If we take nature to mean natural, simple instinct as opposed to self-conscious culture, the work produced under this influence is always old-fashioned, antiquated, and out of date. One touch of nature may make the whole world kin, but 2 touches of nature will destroy any work of art. If, on the other hand, we regard nature as the collection of phenomena external to man, people only discover in her what they bring to her. She has no suggestions of her own. Wordsworth went to the lakes, but he was never a lake poet. He found in stones the sermons he had already hidden there. He went moralizing about the district, but his good work was produced when he returned, not to nature but to poetry. Poetry gave him Laodamia and the fine sonnets, and the great ode such as it is. Nature gave him Martha's Ray and Peter Bell, and the address to Mr. Wilkinson's Spade.
I think that view might be questioned. I am rather inclined to believe in the impulse from a Werner Wood, though of course the artistic value of such an impulse depends entirely on the kind of temperament that receives it, so that the return to nature would come to mean simply the advance to a great personality. You would agree with that, I fancy. However, proceed with your article.